There's even modern day experiments which confirm this frightening truth. Many people think that this corruption only happens to powerful presidents, military dictators, high end CEOs. But the most frightening psychological research shows otherwise. There was an experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment, where 24 ordinary university students were split into two groups. Most people think that ego and power are philosophical concepts. They're not. They're biological, they're psychological, and neurological. If you want to test a person, give them power, then the real person, the inner true self will come out. That is the time to know about a person's true character. Power is one of the most oldest human obsessions. Empires have risen from it. Families have broken for it. People have betrayed their own values, identities, even their own loved ones in the pursuit of it. And this is the truth that most people never ever hear. That power doesn't corrupt good people. Power just actually exposes who they already were. And inside every human being, there is an ego with a hunger for power, the hunger to be seen, the hunger to be respected, and to be in control. And when a person finally tastes power, when they reach that position, when their decisions shape others or they can control others and influence them and they can command attention, something fundamental shifts inside of them. You know what that is? It's the ego that wakes up. And if that ego is not understood, disciplined, trained, and held accountable, it begins to reshape the person from the inside out. In this episode, we're going to look at how this whole thing about power corrupts, how power warps the ego, how the ego abuses the power, and unchecked power destroys people from within. And more importantly, it's about how to remain human, how to remain sane and disciplined when the world gives you power. Most people think that ego and power are philosophical concepts. They're not. They're biological, they're psychological, and neurological. Let me explain. Modern neuroscience shows something remarkable. Power literally changes the brain. Studies from UC Berkeley and Dacre Keltner's power paradox show that people, even when given a small amount of power, become more impulsive, show reduced empathy, take more risks, they listen less, they interrupt more, and attribute their success to themselves rather than the team. The ego does something dangerous here. It whispers, "You did this, you are amazing, you are superior." And slowly, that separation of that truth and reality starts to happen. A psychological distance starts developing. And this is where the human flaws are highlighted in that person who has just been given unchecked power. It's just a normal human trait that unchecked power will at some point start transforming into evilness if not checked. And this is being played out around the world. We are witnessing this not from just in this modern era, but from the beginning of history. Let's take you into a psychological scene, and I want you to picture this. A young man rises through a company. He's hardworking, disciplined, respected. He's humble. He becomes a manager, then gets promoted to become a director, a CEO. And at every stage, something small shifts. When he speaks to people, people agree faster. When he enters the room, people notice him and they adjust themselves. And when he gives an opinion, they don't challenge it. At first, he's confused. Then he becomes accustomed to it. Then he grows to expect it. And eventually, His ego believes it is entitled to it. This is the psychology of power. The world stops correcting you and you stop correcting yourself. Without the challenge, the ego becomes the king. And a king with no truth tellers becomes a tyrant. Not necessarily politically, but emotionally, rationally. The monster inside is allowed to grow to such an extent that there's no stopping it. There's even modern day experiments which confirm this frightening truth. Many people think that this corruption only happens to powerful presidents, military dictators, high-end CEOs, but the most frightening psychological research shows otherwise. There was an experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment, where 24 ordinary university students were split into two groups. The one group was made of prisoners and the other group was made of guards. Within 36 hours, the guards became abusive, escalated punishments, dehumanized the prisoners, and they actually began to enjoy this new dominant role that they adopted. So what does this tell us? This tells us that power doesn't require time to corrupt. It just requires opportunity. The ego adapts to power like fire adapts to oxygen. There was another study, Milgram's obedience study, where participants were told to administer electric shocks to another person when instructed by an authority. So 65% of the participants delivered the maximum voltage, even when hearing screams. They could see clearly the other person was in pain. Why? Because when power speaks, the ego becomes obedient to its own narrative. I'm just following the system. People surrender morality to maintain identity. This is something that we witness all the time when a whole sort of army, or shall I say police forces, execute orders from their governments to perhaps suppress protesters, suppress a civil movement, or just basically clamp down on the public. They are just maintaining orders. This is also highlighted in another study. It was called the empathy deficit study. MRI scans show that the people in positions of power have reduced mirror neuron activity, the very circuits responsible for empathy. Power literally numbs the part of the brain that feels the pain and emotions of others. This is why powerful people can make decisions that devastate others, not because they are evil, but because they no longer feel the emotional weight that others feel. Just think about that for a moment. Sometimes when we're sitting there watching decisions being made which affect or collectively punish others, even inadvertently, it's because the person making that decision no longer feels the emotions and the pains of the ones that they are executing these orders over. This is terrifying because it means anyone, including you and me, can fall into this trap, this ego delusion, if we do not remain conscious. Let's analyze this through the lens of history and see how this was evident in real life scenarios. Let's analyze the rule of Hitler. He was surrounded by generals, advisors, and all types of intellectuals. But the fact was they were all just yes men around him. These were the people who just told him what he wanted to hear. They were too afraid to challenge him. They just reinforced his delusions. Why? Because that's exactly what Hitler wanted to hear. He did not want to hear the truth. He just wanted to comfort his ego. And he just wanted to sort of others to keep inflating his ego. So that's why that illusion becomes a big bubble around him where he cannot see the truth from the falsehood, and his falsehood became the reality for him. And that's why when people get into this self-delusion, then that illusion is broken very violently. He thought he could not lose. He thought everybody else around him was a traitor. Only he was the genius who can take his nation towards victory. This is not political analysis. This is ego pathology. When the ego becomes absolute, the delusion becomes inevitable. Let's look at the second scenario. Another dictator, Stalin. Stalin ruled through fear, but inside he was terrified of losing control, terrified of being challenged, that someone might expose his weakness. The ego thrives on control because it senses the loss of control, and hence why people like Stalin become paranoid. This is the same psychology as the controlling spouse, the manipulative boss, the insecure friend, the jealous sibling. Power amplifies that insecurity. Let's look at a corporate scenario. In that corporate scenario, the power failure looks different but follows the exact same pattern. So let's say you have a CEO who fires the only person willing to confront them, silences dissent, punishes feedback, elevates the loyal people who just say yes, yes around him. Their downfall always starts exactly the same way. They stop listening. The moment a leader stops listening, the ego steps in and takes the throne. And the ego has one rule: it must be right, even when I am wrong. The fall becomes inevitable. Let's look at what the ancient wisdom says about this modern day psychology. Even well before it was documented, wise teachers observed the same truth. Power does not change a person. Power just exposes the inner reality of the person. This is a teaching passed down in spiritual circles. If you want to test a man's character, give him authority and power. Not wealth, not status, not relationships, but power. Why? Because when the person has been given that authority, that powerful position, their inner self becomes visible. If inside them is insecurity, the power magnifies that insecurity. And if inside of them is compassion, then the power will magnify that compassion. And if the ego is strong, that will also be magnified in that position of power, in terms of becoming inflated. So this is what the psychology, modern day psychology, confirms as well, that power reduces self-reflection. The ego whispers, I already know. The ego whispers, I deserve this. The ego says, I do not need to answer to anyone. No one can question me. And that's why the power distorts that feedback. They are jealous. They don't understand me. And slowly the person starts distancing themselves, not because they are strong, it's because they feel that they are unapproachable. Isolation is where the ego becomes its own teacher. And the ego, as you know, is a terrible educator. This is where destruction begins, when a person gets to that state of peak self-delusion. Most people don't even realize that power itself is also very addictive, because most people think that addiction is relating to substances only, like alcohol, drugs, gambling. But modern day psychologists have confirmed that power is also one of the most addictive sensations a human can experience. Why is that? Have you ever thought why? Because power activates the same neural pathways as drugs like cocaine. The dopamine reward loops that make you feel elevated, unstoppable, superior. Over time, the ego becomes dependent on that feeling that power also creates as well. And here's the most dangerous part. The more power a person gets, the less ordinary life feels satisfying. Small victories start to feel boring. Normal conversations feel beneath them. Ordinary people feel slow. Regular emotions feel inconvenient. So as you can see, they start seeing the ordinary person beneath them. Because the ego becomes hungry for stimulation, dominance, and validation. And once the ego is addicted, it will do anything to maintain its high. This is why people in these powerful positions often exaggerate achievements. I can think of a modern day leader who does that pretty well. Overreact to criticism, demonize their opponents, fabricate stories to match their own narrative, manipulate the truth, and they escalate conflict. Think about that. They escalate conflict. How many leaders now and in the past have gone to war because of their ego? They are not strategic moves. They are just withdrawal symptoms of an underlying condition of this addiction that the ego has to power. The ego is only just protecting itself from the power slipping away. A person who becomes aware of this will be the one who can master this, but the majority in these positions are unaware of the ego. That's why they become enslaved to the ego. That is the true addiction. Let me describe a psychological turning point when there comes a moment, a specific moment in that journey of power where a person stops seeing reality as it is and starts seeing reality as they want it to be. This is the tipping point. It's subtle, it's almost invisible, but once crossed, the ego enters that self-deception. You want to know what the signs are? They stop accepting facts. Facts that contradict their narrative are dismissed. They rewrite their intentions. Every action becomes justified. They demonize disagreement. Anyone who challenges them is an enemy. They believe that they are the chosen ones, exceptional, irreplaceable. This is the beginning of emotional dictatorship, whether in a country, a company, marriage, or a friendship. The structure, that macro framework is exactly the same. It's just that it's lifted from one setting to a different setting, from a political office to a corporate environment to inside the house, between a couple, husband and wife dynamics as well. So the actual psychology is exactly the same. The people become disconnected from consequences because they feel untouchable, and that's when they fall, and they do fall hard. History repeats this pattern endlessly. Leaders don't fall because of enemies, because of their own blindness. They become blind to their own flaws, and that applies to anybody, whether it's in a corporate setting or, let's say, a tyrant, let's say an abusive husband, or it could be an abusive wife. Anybody in a domestic setting who thinks that they are invincible will end up having a very strong fall. And let's understand that the power, this extreme power, reduces the ability of the brain to empathize with others. It refuses to anticipate consequences. It is unable to do a logical and rational assessment of any risk and consequences. It cannot delay gratification. It wants instant gratifications. In other words, the power temporarily disables the executive function systems that keep people grounded. Let me give you a very simple metaphor, an example how you'll be able to understand this better. Imagine a person standing on a balcony 40 floors up. Initially, they are cautious, they respect the height, they're aware of the risk, they hold the railings, but over time they grow confident. They become comfortable. They become careless. Eventually, they lean forward a little bit too much and they end up falling. This is exactly how power works, exactly the same way as in that scenario of standing at a top height. It gives this perspective to the person that They are now comfortable, they are safe, there's no risks whatsoever. And the deepest tragedy, most people would not even realize they've fallen until they've hit the ground. Let's look at the power dynamics of what causes people to start thinking the way they do when they assume these positions of power and authority. There's three types of power that psychologists have identified in major sort of categories. Number one is the role of power, the authority that which comes from a position. It could be a CEO, a judge, a manager, or an elected official, even a teacher. So this role, power gives legitimacy, but it also breeds entitlement. The ego says, I am above. I have a higher rank to these people. And once a person believes that they are above others, they stop believing that they can be wrong. Number two, somebody could be in a position of authority because of their expertise. A doctor, a scholar, even a psychologist, a religious leader, a scientist. Knowledge is beautiful, but the ego uses knowledge as armor. It whispers, you know more than them. You understand better. They cannot question you. This leads to intellectual arrogance, the belief that deeper insight equals moral superiority. This is one of the most dangerous forms of ego corruption. Finally, social power, where somebody rises to this position because of their influence. Maybe they are a celebrity, an influencer, a public speaker, some charismatic type of a personality, like even a podcaster. This is the most volatile form of power because the ego becomes addicted to attention. The validation becomes a drug. The followers are their currency. The popularity becomes their identity. And when this collapses, the person disappears and collapses with it. So let's look at a story of a leader who's perhaps in that role where they've self-destructed themselves. Their own position, their own ego inflation has caused their own self-destruction. So let's think of somebody who rises from nothing and comes into a position of power. Maybe they had a hard life, they came from a less privileged background, they were ignored in adulthood, bullied at school. Then finally, one day, this person gains influence. People listen, doors open, opportunities come their way. At first, they will use that power wisely to help others and remember what it felt like to be a weaker member of society. But soon, slowly, something shifts inside of them. They begin to enjoy that attention, the praise, and this form of control they've got. They stop listening to criticism. They have a software update in their head where they think that they are much more superior than others, where people are constantly, telling them, you are brilliant, you are good. And they sort of hate the dissenting voices of anybody who challenges them. And they basically just surround themselves with people who keep pumping their ego up to this new level of self-delusion. And slowly, this person will become a prisoner of their own ego. One day, tragedy will unfold. And when does that happen? When they start rising and rising, but they're actually falling. They don't realize that they are falling. So he or she may think they're becoming stronger, but the fact is they're becoming more fragile. They think they're becoming a master of their game, but the fact is they're becoming a slave to their ego. This is a story repeated thousands of times in history, politics, business, religion, and even in families, because the ego has no preference as to who it targets. It will consume anyone in its path in any particular field. This is the actual irony of the whole situation, that no matter who you are, whether you're the tyrant whose ego has been inflated in the corporate sector or at home or in politics or in show business, you will end up suffering the same fate. And ancient wise people have constantly told us and shared these lessons with us, these universal lessons. They've actually given us warnings about this, that he who cannot govern himself cannot govern others. This is not any motivational speak. This is a psychological truth. Self-governance means regulating your impulses, recognizing your ego when it's being inflated, staying grounded, being humble, accepting this criticism from others and learning from it, welcoming challenges to your version of events, and most importantly, listening to things and not always just listening to flattery. So when a person lacks the self-governance, the power becomes a weapon against themselves. Modern psychology confirms this same idea. The higher the power, the more self-awareness is required. And if this self-awareness rises, power will become a form of wisdom. If self-awareness collapses, that power will also become a self-destruction for the person. This is the whole ethos of ego psychology. And that's why people who end up in these positions don't become tyrants all of a sudden. They slowly creep up into those positions because the ego creeps in through three different cracks. And what are those cracks? Number one, maybe childhood trauma. If a person has had childhood trauma, this power becomes a way to feel significant again. Number two, they may have had insecurity. And if a person fears rejection or failure, the power becomes their protection. And number three, validation hunger. If a person seeks admiration, the power becomes a drug for self-validation. Once these wounds meet influence, the ego uses the power to feed that emptiness inside. And the person is no longer seeking to serve. They are seeking to be filled. They are beginning their journey towards tyranny. And this is one of the most dangerous things that we see unfold before our eyes. That's why good people, especially in politics, when they are voted in, they end up becoming the worst leaders and fail to serve those very people who voted them in and breaking all the promises that they made before they came into power. And this is why they need to build humility. Power without humility is the tragedy that we are seeing unfold right in front of our eyes around the world. Because humility is often misunderstood. People think humility means weakness or self-doubt, but it's not. It means accountability. It means the willingness to admit that you are wrong, and it means you are there to serve others, and it will give you that emotional maturity, the inner mastery that all these people that we've talked about need to adopt in order to achieve that. So the humility is the antidote to that ego which craves the power and which is constantly inflated for the wrong reasons. And this is why a strong person can say, I might be wrong, please tell me, correct me, help me where I cannot see. So this is truly the strong leader, not the one who silences the dissent, not the one who hates criticism, driven by his inflated ego. Sorry, I use the word he, but just to illustrate the point, the ego hates humility because humility dethrones the ego. And without this humility, the power suffocates the person from within. Modern neuroscience talks about the power paradox. What is that? That's when a person who has certain traits which have helped them get into power, maybe it's humility, their empathy, their compassion, but as soon as they achieve that position of power, those very same qualities begin to erode inside of them. This could be the manager who suddenly starts speaking to staff like their children because the manager has just been promoted over them. A celebrity who forgets what normal criticism feels like because their ego has elevated them to a very high status. A politician who genuinely believes that the laws do not apply to him or her. A religious figure who interprets disagreement as rebellion. It's because the ego hijacks power the moment it enters the bloodstream. Power stops being a responsibility and becomes a mirror reflecting a distorted self-image. And that very same person may distort the reality out there through their distorted perception of the reality out there. This is why so many powerful people begin to live in a psychological hallucination. They don't see the reality that me and you are seeing. They see their own version of reality. This is what we keep talking about, living in a bubble or living in an illusion. So this is truly a delusion of power because they think I am the exception. The ego convinces them that the rules do not apply to them. This is why scandals happen and unfold relating to CEOs, or why athletes cheat, presidents lie, influencers fall from grace. And this is why they do that, because they think that the rules don't apply to them. They are operating from a different reality now. And that's why you see these spectacular falls from grace. It won't happen to me. I remember doing one of these traffic highway courses for once, just a little bit of speeding. Sometimes you get caught into a photograph by a speed camera. And the instructor said something very interesting. They said, why do you think accidents happen? That's a good question. Why do accidents happen? They happen because of the people who drive recklessly think that they are never ever going to have an accident. Accidents happen to other people. It's exactly the same self-delusion that is in operation here with people with inflated egos. They always think that they are better than others and they can make decisions which are detached from reality because they've stopped listening and they start dictating. And the irony is, the higher you rise, the more you need dissenting voices, not fewer, because history is full of leaders who fell because the only people around them were fearful yes men who just submitted to their power, protecting their salaries rather than speaking the truth. Without challenge, the ego becomes a tyrant. This is the most dangerous delusion, that you think you are the power. When power becomes a form of identity and you are not in a position, you no longer want to relinquish it, you feel that you're giving your identity away as this most powerful man or woman in this position, in this company, in the country. And because the ego has constantly pumped you up so much and has created this sort of territorial situation in your mind that this is yours, it belongs to you, this power, this office. And that's how monsters are created, whether it's in the home, it's in the office, or in the political establishments. The problem is in the power. The problem is the ego, which has become attached to it. I want to finish off from a modern day example of this ego psychology. This was a study done by the University of California, and they found that the more power a person feels, the less capable they become of recognizing other people's feelings, even when the emotional cues are obvious, because that power desensitizes the person. When you no longer feel others, when you begin to think only about yourself, you become ego-centrified. This is why powerful people often say, how could this happen? I didn't realize people felt this way. No one told me. I thought everyone was fine. Of course they didn't see it. Their ego made them blind. And they have people around them who never tell them the truth because they're too afraid to tell them the truth. And this is why that blind ego becomes so defensive. It starts inventing enemies. He's trying to take my position. She's undermining me. They're jealous of me. My family doesn't appreciate me. My partner doesn't respect me, because it's the ego that's constantly whispering these stories to the person. And this is what ultimately destroys them. And this is why we need to be humble, and we need to be constantly checking ourselves to ensure that we are not living in that self-delusion, which will end up becoming our own self-destruction.